In the summer of 1941, the fertile plains of Ukraine stretched endlessly under a blazing sun. Children played in wheat fields that would soon run red with blood. Families gathered around dinner tables that would be empty within months. This is the story of a land caught between two totalitarian giants. A story of survival, resistance, and unimaginable suffering. Ukraine didn't choose this war, but for 4 years, it became the epicenter of the most devastating conflict in human history. By the time the guns fell silent, over 6 million Ukrainians lay dead, soldiers and civilians alike, victims of a war that transformed their homeland into a graveyard. June 22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m., the earth shook along the Bug River as German artillery unleashed hell. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun. Ukraine, with its strategic position and agricultural wealth, became Nazi Germany's primary target. The German war machine rolled across the Ukrainian border like a mechanical plague. Wehrmacht divisions, supported by Romanian and Hungarian forces, advanced on 3 fronts. In the north, they aimed for Kiev. In the center, Kharkiv. In the south, the prize of Odessa and the oil fields beyond. But this wasn't just a military campaign. It was a war of extermination. Hitler's hunger plan called for the systematic starvation of 30 million Slavs to make room for German settlers. Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, would feed the Reich while its people starved. The Red Army, caught completely off guard, began a catastrophic retreat. Entire divisions were surrounded and destroyed before they could even understand what was happening. In the chaos, Ukrainian civilians faced an impossible choice: flee east toward Stalin's terror, or stay and face Hitler's genocide. By August 1941, German forces had executed one of the most devastating encirclements in military history. Near the city of Uman, they trapped over 100,000 Soviet troops in a massive cauldron, a ring of steel from which few would escape. The Battle of Uman wasn't just a military disaster, it was a human catastrophe. Among the surrounded forces were thousands of Ukrainian conscripts, farmers and factory workers who had been handed rifles and told to stop the German advance. They fought with desperate courage, but courage alone couldn't stop panzers. General Mikhail Karponos, commander of the Southwestern Front, watched his armies disintegrate. His radio messages to Moscow grew increasingly desperate. Send reinforcements. Send ammunition. Send anything. But Stalin's response was always the same: stand and fight. Retreat is forbidden. When the cauldron finally collapsed, 103,000 Soviet soldiers marched into German captivity. For Ukrainian POWs, this meant almost certain death. Nazi racial ideology classified Slavs as subhuman, unworthy of protection under international law. Of the nearly 3 million Soviet prisoners taken in 1941, over 2 million would die in German camps. The roads around Uman were littered with the debris of war: abandoned tanks, scattered equipment, and the bodies of those who had tried to break free. But the greatest tragedy was yet to come: the systematic murder of Ukrainian civilians who had welcomed the Germans as liberators from Stalin's tyranny. Spring 1942. After the disasters of 1941, the Red Army was desperate to prove it could still fight. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko planned a massive counteroffensive to recapture Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city. It would be the Soviet Union's first major offensive operation, and one of its most catastrophic failures. The offensive began on May 12 with over 640,000 Soviet troops, including many Ukrainian units desperate to liberate their homeland. Initial success was stunning. Soviet forces broke through German lines and advanced toward Kharkiv, raising hopes that the tide of war might finally be turning. But the Germans had laid a trap. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into the salient, Wehrmacht units closed in from both flanks. Within days, the offensive became another encirclement, another cauldron of death. Ukrainian soldiers found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Cut off from supplies, surrounded by enemy forces, they fought with whatever they could find. Tank crews continued fighting even after their fuel ran out. Infantry units held positions until their ammunition was exhausted, then fought with bayonets and bare hands. The final statistics were staggering: 277,000 Soviet casualties, including 171,000 captured. Entire Ukrainian divisions were wiped out in a matter of days. The cream of the Red Army's officer corps, men who had survived Stalin's purges and the disasters of 1941, died in the wheat fields outside Kharkiv. For Ukrainian families, the Kharkiv offensive represented a double tragedy. Not only had their sons and fathers died in the failed attack, but the catastrophic defeat ensured that German occupation would continue for another 2 years. The liberation of Ukraine would have to wait. August 18, 1941. The Dnipro River had been Ukraine's lifeline for centuries, a source of power, transportation, and pride. The massive hydroelectric dam at Zaporizhia was a symbol of Soviet industrial might, providing electricity to much of southern Ukraine. But as German forces approached, Stalin made a decision that would haunt Ukraine for generations. Rather than let the dam fall into enemy hands, he ordered its destruction. The explosion was heard over 100 kilometers away. When the dam burst, it released a wall of water that swept away everything in its path. Entire villages vanished beneath the flood. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians, men, women, and children drowned in the artificial tsunami. The human cost was devastating, but the strategic impact was minimal. German engineers had the river crossing restored within weeks. The destruction of the dam achieved nothing except the murder of innocent Ukrainians, victims of Stalin's scorched earth policy. This wasn't warfare. It was terrorism against his own people. Stalin's willingness to sacrifice Ukrainian lives to slow the German advance revealed the true nature of Soviet rule. To Moscow, Ukrainians were expendable, their lives worth less than concrete and steel. The flooded zone remained a wasteland for months. Bodies of men, women, and children washed up on riverbanks hundreds of kilometers downstream. The fertile soil of the Dnipro Valley, once Ukraine's pride, became a mass grave. When Soviet forces finally returned in 1943, they found a landscape transformed. Where once stood thriving communities, there was only mud and rubble. The Dnipro Dam would eventually be rebuilt, but the thousands who died in its destruction would never be forgotten. January 1944. The tide of war had turned, but Ukraine remained a battlefield. Near the town of Korsun, 2 German corps, over 60,000 men, found themselves trapped in another encirclement. But this time it was the Soviets who held the ring. The Battle of Korsun would become known as the Little Stalingrad, a savage fight in the depths of winter. German forces, including the elite SS Viking division, were surrounded by Soviet and Ukrainian troops determined to exact revenge for 3 years of occupation. For Ukrainian soldiers fighting with the Red Army, this was personal. They had seen their villages burned, their families murdered, their homeland turned into a wasteland. Now, finally, they had the chance to strike back. The fighting was merciless. Neither side gave quarter. German attempts to break out were met with fierce resistance. Soviet attacks were repelled with desperate courage. The snow around Korsun turned red with the blood of both armies. Inside the pocket, conditions were hellish. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Wounded men froze to death in the snow. The lucky ones died quickly. When the pocket finally collapsed in February, only 35,000 Germans escaped. The rest, over 25,000 men, were dead or captured. The battlefield was littered with frozen corpses, destroyed tanks, and abandoned equipment. But victory came at a terrible price. Soviet and Ukrainian forces suffered over 80,000 casualties. Entire villages in the battle zone were destroyed in the fighting. Once again, Ukrainian civilians paid the highest price for a war they hadn't chosen. The Battle of Korsun marked a turning point, the beginning of the end for German occupation of Ukraine. But it also demonstrated the savage nature of the Eastern Front, where battles were fought with a brutality that shocked even hardened veterans. In the forests and mountains of western Ukraine, a different kind of war was being fought. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, waged a guerrilla campaign against both German and Soviet forces, fighting for Ukrainian independence. Led by commanders like Roman Shukovich, the UPA was born from desperation and hope. Ukrainian nationalists who had initially welcomed the Germans as liberators soon discovered that Nazi occupation was no better than Soviet rule. In some ways, it was worse. The UPA fought a three-way war against German occupiers, Soviet forces, and sometimes Polish partisans. Their tactics were guerrilla warfare at its most brutal. Ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks that bled the occupying forces. Soviet convoys traveling through western Ukraine faced constant attack. UPA fighters, many of them former Red Army soldiers, knew the terrain intimately. They struck without warning, then melted back into the forest like ghosts. The UPA's war was particularly savage in its treatment of civilians. All sides committed atrocities, Germans, Soviets, and Ukrainians alike. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned. Collaborators were executed. Innocent people died for the crimes of others. In Volhynia, ethnic tensions exploded into massacres. UPA units killed thousands of Polish civilians, while Polish partisans retaliated against Ukrainians. The line between resistance and terrorism became blurred in a cycle of violence that consumed entire communities. The UPA's resistance continued long after the war ended. Some fighters held out in the forests until the 1950s, waging a hopeless struggle against overwhelming Soviet forces. Their sacrifice was largely forgotten during the Soviet era, but their memory lived on in the hearts of Ukrainians who dreamed of independence. The Carpathian Mountains of western Ukraine became the site of some of the war's most brutal fighting. In these rugged peaks and dense forests, every ridge was contested, every valley fought over. The Carpathians were more than just terrain, they were a barrier between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. Control of the mountain passes meant control of the routes into Hungary, Romania, and ultimately Germany itself. Fighting in the Carpathians was a nightmare of snow, ice, and vertical cliffs. Soldiers on both sides struggled not just against the enemy, but against the mountains themselves. Frostbite claimed as many casualties as bullets. Avalanches buried entire units. Ukrainian mountain troops, many of them local men who knew every trail and cave, fought with desperate skill. They had seen their villages burned, their families murdered. For them, every German pushed back was a step toward liberation. German forces, unaccustomed to mountain warfare, struggled against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the rocks themselves. Their heavy equipment was useless on the narrow mountain paths. Their tanks couldn't climb the steep slopes. The battles for the Carpathian passes lasted months. Each peak taken cost hundreds of lives. Each valley liberated was paid for in blood. But slowly, inexorably, the Germans were pushed back. When the Carpathians were finally cleared of German forces, the cost was staggering. Entire communities had been wiped out. The mountains were littered with the debris of war, abandoned equipment, makeshift graves, and the bones of those who had died for a few meters of rocky ground. By the spring of 1944, the tide had turned. German forces were in full retreat across Ukraine. Soviet armies, strengthened by Western aid and motivated by vengeance, pushed relentlessly westward. The liberation of Ukraine came at a terrible price. Cities like Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa were ruins. The countryside was devastated. Millions of Ukrainians were dead, and millions more had been deported to Germany as slave laborers. But liberation didn't mean freedom. As Soviet forces reoccupied Ukrainian territory, they brought with them a new wave of terror. Anyone suspected of collaboration with the Germans was arrested. UPA fighters were hunted down and executed. Ukrainian intellectuals, priests, and community leaders disappeared into the Gulag. The numbers tell the story of Ukraine's suffering. Over 6 million Ukrainians died during the war, roughly 16% of the population. Of these, 1.5 million were soldiers, 1.5 million were Jews murdered in the Holocaust, and 3 million were civilians killed by war, famine, and repression. Ukraine had been a battlefield between two totalitarian empires. Caught between Hitler's genocide and Stalin's terror, The Ukrainian people had endured suffering that defies comprehension. Their crime was simple. They existed on land that others wanted to control. Today, Ukraine remembers. In monuments and museums, in stories passed down through generations, the memory of those dark years lives on. The lesson is clear. Freedom is never free, and the price of survival is eternal vigilance. The Ukrainian people survived Hitler's final solution and Stalin's terror. They endured occupation, deportation, and genocide. Their story is one of the most tragic in human history, but also one of the most inspiring. This film is dedicated to the memory of all Ukrainians who suffered and died during World War II. Their sacrifice must never be forgotten.